Hello and welcome to this video on methods you can use to thicken your maple bonsai trunk. Taking a tree of any kind and turning it into a bonsai can be simple enough. Chop it short and narrow. This will create a very early bonsai, and you may not want to wait the years it will take to develop into your ideal image of a bonsai. This video will offer you some information and hopefully allow you to skip some time to get a much thicker trunk very early on. This is the first thing you'll need to give your bonsai the illusion of age and majesty. The first and perhaps easiest method is a sacrifice branch. The sacrifice branches are, let's say, popular, mostly because they're not really going to cause any harm to your tree. They are very low risk and they give you a solid return. The downside is that they do take a lot more time than other methods do. What you do can be summarily described as grow a branch relatively low down on the trunk, and this is a point at which all of the necessary energy that the tree is generating will get siphoned off. By encouraging this branch to grow, you'll add more weight and pressure and force the trunk to widen to compensate for this branch. By keeping it relatively unkept, that is, more or less only pruning it to ensure it grows outwards, you keep the trunk growing wider and wider to compensate over time. This has all the advantages we've mentioned of being relatively low impact. The only caveat to that is when you go to remove the sacrifice branch. Depending on how big the branch has become, you may leave quite a large scar behind, and it may take many years for that scar to completely heal over. Another method, which is in some respects much easier, is to fuse multiple trunks together. This is useful more so for fast-growing species, but it can be done with maples. By fusing all of the trunks in a number of much smaller examples together, you can get a very thick, solid core very early on. The challenge you'll have is that you need to make sure that you grow it in such a way that the entirety of the inside is solid. You don't want small gaps where water can accumulate and eventually rot. The other issue is that it does take some time. You'll need at least 2, maybe 3 years in some cases for the trees to merge together or fuse. You'll also need a number of individual small trees. You can do so with as few as 2 or as many as you can possibly fit into a small enough space. We've shown before how you can do this by putting a PVC pipe in the center and using that to minimize the number of plants needed. But you could instead simply stack them all together like a bundle of sticks, tie something tightly around them to bring them tight together, and leave them to grow. Remembering though, you need to make sure you squish them together hard. You do not want to have any gaps in the trunk area if you can avoid it. Not only does it leave it open to rot and mold, but it also takes much longer to fuse. You'll also want to be mindful that not every tree involved in this process will succeed, and so you want to have some replacement plants available if things go badly. Another option, and this is one more often used when trying to wire and move very thick trunks, is to split them. To be specific, you want to try and cut them lengthways down the trunk. When you do this, you'll force a small gap in the center of the trunk. Similar in some ways to fusing, but you're now trying to fuse 2 sides or 2 parts of one single trunk. The gap in the middle will need to be healed over, and that's the challenge you have, making sure that that heals over before any other problems occur. The process itself can be done as you see here, where you take a tool and you cut through the trunk, you then force the trunk apart, and then you put something in there to space it. This space will ensure it has to heal over and can't simply close back on itself. By doing this, you allow the entire trunk to grow and heal, and the roots will compensate for this. A much more controversial approach, let's say, is to induce swelling. And this is also sometimes described as inducing scarring. It is controversial in that many people disagree with it and view it as a high risk, relatively low reward option. That is, you induce the opportunity for things like pathogens like mold to get in there and kill your tree, for something that other methods could work just as well to achieve. There are a few different ways to induce swelling, whether that is to use a wire tourniquet or to cut into the tree trunk itself. Despite the method you choose, just be aware that there are these risks attached to it. The catch is that you do need to use it on a reasonably fast-growing species. So again, a maple will work if you do so early in the growing season, but you want to be careful of when and how you do it. Too late in the season and the tree will not catch up. Too early and you may induce damage you can't compensate for. The other issue is that you may leave scars on the tree permanently. If you really want to skip all the time involved, you can look at air layering from a much larger tree. This is somewhat cheating, admittedly, but if you take a branch from a much larger tree with a very thick girth to it, you can air layer that off, and now you have a very thick trunk, and you haven't had to do a great deal more work. The challenge is getting access to a much larger tree and having the time available to air layer it, as that can take a year or more. If you don't have that kind of time, but you do have many smaller trees you want to try and grow up, you can try and plant them into large pots. Now the trick here is that you are convincing the tree it's basically in the ground, and as a result, the roots will grow wider and longer. The trunk itself will also widen to accommodate this extra root mass. That will allow for it to grow, and as long as it doesn't eventually reach to the edge of the pot, it will keep trying to widen. This is why very wide and shallow pots work, or you can choose to use very deep and wide pots. Regardless of your option, the idea is to make sure the tree gets the idea that it's in the soil, in the wild, so to speak, not in an actual pot. This method can also be combined with many other different methods. You can, if you are going to do this, try and also prune to redirect growth. That is, cutting back the tree aggressively to only those areas that you want growth, and keeping on top of this judiciously. By ensuring that the tree only has growth where you want it, it will constantly be trying to expand and use that energy somehow. Whether this is putting more girth into the trunk or putting more growth into the branches you want to see growing. By pruning anything else back and ensuring no growth occurs that you do not want to see, all growth will occur where you do want it. Don't forget though that all of this is going to be moot if you don't keep on top of the other requirements. For example, you need to make sure that you are using the proper soil. You don't want waterlogged soil or super dry soil. You want to make sure it has full sunlight if that's what the species requires, or partial shade. You want to make sure that you're fertilizing properly, using the right kind of fertilizer at the right time of year. That means reasonable amount of nitrogen early in spring, followed by appropriate levels throughout the rest of summer and autumn. Ensure that it's in the right kind of environment to protect it from harsh weather. Are you worried about early or late frosts? Is your area prone to snow? The list of problems goes on. Are you checking on your wiring to make sure it doesn't cut into those branches and cause damage you now have to worry about rectifying? Is your sacrifice branch in the right place? If you have it too high or too low, you're going to have the same problems. And making sure that when you plant it out, that you've planted it in the right kind of pot. For example, is it currently in a training pot? Or have you gone straight to a bonsai pot and skipped everything else and likely caused more problems for yourself? There are a variety of steps that could be used, and we have a video on choosing the right kind of pot for your bonsai as well. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found the information contained in this video useful, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any questions, comments, or suggestions you have below.